I can't say what the advertised topic was because there was no advertised topic. Um, Broadly speaking, this is often the introduction I give to my chavruas. Hopefully, by the time we're done, we'll understand one Pischei Teshuvah. That's the goal. We're going to understand one Pischei Teshuvah. If we got that, then we did what we were trying to do. To understand the Pischei Teshuvah, it's going to take however long it takes. Okay, so let's do some back. We'll read the Pischei Teshuvah first. Sounds pretty innocent, and then we'll find out how guilty it is. Right? How difficult this Pischei Teshuvah really is. Pischei Teshuvah in Simcha Samach in Sivkon Chabez says, "Ein Magen Avram, Simon Reish Beis, Shekasav Shein Shibali Aleket." The Magen Avram quotes in Shibali Aleket, "Lovin Beribbis L'Tzorech Seudas Shabbos or Seudas Mitzvah." You're allowed to borrow money with Ribbis for the purpose of paying for a Seudas Shabbos or any other Seudas Mitzvah. V'ayim b'Sefer Be'er Yaakov Sham V'kan, and look at the Sefer Be'er Yaakov here and there in our Chaim. Shekasav, who writes, "Ratzalom Ribbis Drabanan." Shibali Aleket, of course, means you can only borrow money with Ribbis Drabanan upashatu, and that's obvious. Okay, I can't Pischei Teshuvah. Sounds pretty innocent, right? Chavez. So the Shibali Aleket has this seemingly mechushtik heter. You're allowed to borrow money with Ribbis for a Seudas mitzvah, and the Be'er Yaakov says, well, of course, that means Ribbis Drabanan, not Ribbis Daraisa. Why? What? No, Pischei Teshuvah gives you no information. Ayin Sham, right? So you want to understand. So if we want to be Ayin Sham, so we have to, it's going to take us a while. Okay. So let's do the background. Why is this in Simcha Samach? What's it doing here? So the reason why it's doing here is the Pischei Teshuvah is commenting on the din that you're of Moshe Yisomim. The Gemara on Daf Ayin in Vav Mitzia. The Gemara says, Amar Avanan Amar Shmuel Moshe Yisomim Muter Lavosam Beribbis. The Gemara says that you're allowed to lend money of Yisomim with interest, seemingly any interest, Ribbis Daraisa, Ribbis Rabban, whatever you want. So Amalei Rav Nachman and the Yasmin Safinu Isura, because they're orphans, they're allowed to do whatever they want. We can make them eat isurim, literally. Yasmi da'achi la to do leisler basu shakayu. If the orphans want to eat isurim, so let them follow the one who made them orphans. Right? Let them also die. Okay, pretty extreme. So the Gemara says, "What do you do?" So the Gemara comes out. Well, what it means is Moshe Yisomim muter lahavosan karov l'schav rachot lahefsid. It means you're allowed to lend money of Yisomim in a way that's Ribbis D'Rabbanan. Particularly, the Gemara says, you're allowed to lend the money if it's a situation where the Yisomim stand to gain and not to lose. Right? Karov l'schar, if they'll make a joint investment with somebody, if the investment is profitable, if they make money, so the Yisomim get part of the profits. If the business tanks, so the Yisomim lose nothing, they get their principal, they get their investment back. So zero exposure and 50% profit or something like that. That's the deal, the Ribbis Drabanan, that you're allowed to lend, with which you're allowed to lend Moshe Yisomim. In terms of just basic building blocks of the sugya, so the Rashba has a suggestion that maybe the Gemara only means this type of Ribbis Drabanan, where the Ribbis, quote unquote, is from the Yisomim's money itself. Their money makes money, right? But if you wanted to lend Moshe Yisomim with Avak Ribbis, somehow that wouldn't be mutter. But only this type of Ribbis Drabanan is mutter. So Mechaber doesn't pass like that in Sifyat Ches. The Mechaber passes that all Ribbis Drabanan, call Ribbis Drabanan mutter Moshe Yisomim. That's the fact. The Mechaber is based on the Rosh and the Rambam, who the Beis Yossi points out don't have that limitation. They just say Avak Ribbis is mutter Moshe Yisomim. Fine. The Torah adds a little bit. You have to. It's the type of thing you'd want a mucker for, but there isn't much of one. That the example in the Gemara of Moshe Yisomim is lav dafka. It also means other mitzvah institutions, Moshe Tzedakah, or Talmud Torah, or a shul. All these things are allowed. All these entities, institutions, whatever they are, money that is the property of those institutions or things, you're allowed to lend with Ribbis D'Rabbanan. Seemingly, right? Rashi writes the reason why you're allowed to lend money, Moshe Yisomim Ribbis D'Rabbanan, is because we don't want their money to run out. Right? They can't make any money because they don't know how. So we don't want their assets to be depleted, and therefore we need to provide some way of increasing their assets. So we'll lend their money Ribbis D'Rabbanan. Okay. So apparently, shuls, yeshivas, and tzedakahs always are in need of more money. Also, some things don't change, right? So that's the Torah assumes, and this is the Psak of the Mechaber, that all of these mitzvah entities are allowed to lend their money Ribbis D'Rabbanan. I won't answer that question. Maybe it depends who your CFO is. Okay, so I don't that's Maybe if Rabbi Fagan is the CFO, they know how. I don't know. So I don't know. Okay, fine. So what's the chat in this leniency? Again, this is all things that are referred to in Beis Yosef. Just this is all the before we do anything fancy, you have to do what's basic. So Rashi writes in the Sugya and Bava Metzia and Daf Ayin that the reason why Moshe Yisomim is mutter to lend money Ribbis Rabbanan, or the mechanism by which you can lend money Moshe Yisomim Ribbis Rabbanan is because hefker based on hefker. The Gemara says we give the money, we give the money to somebody Neman, we give it to Beidina. That's the lush of the Gemara. So Rashi says Bifnei Bezdin Sheish Lem Koach LaHafker Nechsei HaMakabel Eitz Yisomim L'Hasel Simo Kar L'Sach Aruch L'Hafsid, because only Bezdin is empowered, seemingly through the mechanism hefker based on hefker. Yesh Lem Koach LaHafker Nechsei HaMakabel Eitz Yisomim. So therefore, so Bezdin essentially declares that this money that's being invested doesn't really belong to the person who's investing it. It really belongs to, I don't know, it belongs to the Yisomim. So all the profit goes to the Yisomim, and that's not a problem of Ribbis because should there be profits, the money doesn't really belong to the other investor. It belongs to the Yisomim. Belongs to the Yisomim, then they can make all the profit that they want. Right, and then somehow the money will go back. Half the money will go back to the investor. At the end of this enterprise. Okay, very nice. That's the way Rashi says it. The Mordechai seems to say like that also. The Beis Yosef is medayik that the Rosh and the Rashba explicitly rejects Rashi. The Rashba says, why would you need hefker bes and hefker? If we're talking about ribbis d'Rabbanan, so hey mamru ve mamru, let Chazal aser ribbis d'Rabbanan. Let Chazal say that it's mutter in this case. What do you need hefker bes and hefker for? The Beis Yosef medayik, the Rosh agrees, because the Rosh says, why do we give the money of the Yisomim b'fnei Bezdin? So the Rosh says because of Eimas Bezdin, right? We want the Makabel to take this very seriously. You should know Bezdin is behind the Yisomim on this one. This is not a laughing matter. This is not a small thing. We're trusting you with the Moshe Yisomim. We want you to really try your best. Okay, so the Rosh has to give a reason. It doesn't sound like Bezdin is needed for any technical halachic function. It's just it'll be better for the entire enterprise if it's done if it's given over b'fnei Bezdin. The Beis Yosef Medayik, the Rosh also doesn't accept Rashi that you need hefker based on hefker. My nafkamina means nice nafkamina lumdis was. What's the nafkamina? So the Shach already sounds like the nafkamina is that not every Bezdin is empowered to have hefker based on hefker. According to most Rishonim, you need a Bezdin chashuv to have hefker based on hefker. Do we have a Bezdin chashuv nowadays? Probably not. It's hard to have a Bezdin chashuv nowadays. So how exactly are you going to do hefker based on hefker nowadays? So Shach says, yeah, I never saw anybody who practiced this kula because we're choshesh for Rashi, despite the fact that the Ramah doesn't pass like Rashi. Says the minig is to make. The Shach says I never saw it. Very nice. The Shach never saw it. Lo reinu ein raya. Although the Shach says by minhagim lo reinu is a raya, but the Noda Yehuda says, what do you mean? I did it myself. So the Noda Yehuda, the Pischei Teshuvah quotes from the Noda Yehuda that no, even despite what the Shach says, we're not actually choshesh for Rashi, and this is a kula that you can follow halacha l'maisa. Okay, fine. That's the background. Okay. Now, in that context, that's where the Pischei Teshuvah quotes from this Shibbolei Leket that Seudas, that you're allowed to lend money Ribbis d'Rabbanan for a Seudas mitzvah, and you're allowed to lend money Ribbis for a Seudas Shabbos or a Seudas mitzvah. And the Ber Yaakov says, of course, he means Ribbis d'Rabbanan. First of all, who was the Ber Yaakov? I don't know. He was someone in Frankfurt. The Sefer was published in 1767, if I did the math right. So it was a long time ago. I looked it up. He doesn't really say any makar in the Shibbolei Leket why he would say this, why he would say it's limited to Ribbis d'Rabbanan. He just says, well, he has a raya. He's a raya he's an indirect raya from a Gemara in Sanhedrin. It's a raya from omission. The Gemara assumes something. How the Gemara know to assume that? It's the type of raya that if you need to be doicha, you probably could find the tzchiyah for. I didn't work too hard. It's not a diuk anywhere. It's a cheshbon, right? And he says, but of course, misvara, how could you allow Ribbis d'Oraisa for a Seudas Shabbos? What kind of heter would that be? So he says, it must be, we're only talking about Ribbis d'Rabbanan, it's like Ma'aseh Yisomim. So very nice. Misvara makes a lot of sense. The only problem is, if you actually look at the Shibbolei Leket, it's not what he says. It's not what he says, but it isn't what he says. The Shibbolei Leket says like this. This is in Shibbolei Leket Inyan Shabbos, Siman Nun Hey. I wrote the lashon down over here. Yerushalmi. So that's your first clue. The Shibbolei Leket doesn't quote the Gemara in Bava Metzia and Daf Ayin. That's not the makar. The Shibbolei Leket says it's a Yerushalmi. Perak Misha Hafach Zesav. Yerushalmi Moed Katan. It's also in Sanhedrin, but so Yerushalmi Moed Katan, not even Bava Metzia. Amr B'Yochanan. Lovin B'Ribbis l'chaburas mitzvah u'l'kiddush hachodesh. You're allowed to borrow money with interest for a chaburas mitzvah, some kind of people are getting together for a mitzvah, and for a sud of kiddush hachodesh. Gemara talks about this in Sanhedrin. It's not so clear. There's some kind of practice mitzvah, not so clear exactly what it is, to have a sud for the people who are mekadesh hachodesh to have a suda. Okay. What exactly is the mitzvah there? Not clear. I don't think it's a mitzvah daraisa. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but the Gemara never quotes a makar for such a thing. It just says that there was such a practice, and for that you're allowed to borrow money for ribbis. Rabbi Yochanan b'tzafra havanachas the knishta. Rabbi Yochanan in the morning would go to the room where they had this Seudah for Kiddush HaChodesh, v'hava malaket perurin, and he would gather up the crumbs, the pieces of bread from seemingly from the floor, and he would eat them. And said, I want my portion to be amongst the people who ate here last night. He wanted to have a part in this Seudas mitzvah, seemingly, and therefore he went and had the shirayim, right? Shirayim from a Seudas mitzvah, right? Apparently that's a good thing. Says the Sheba'aleket, Mashramei Hacha. So it appears from here. So any Seudas mitzvah you can borrow money for Ribbis. So follows from there that also for a Seudas Shabbos, Seudas Yontiv, that's also Seudas mitzvah. So you're allowed to borrow money for Ribbis. So let's note immediately two things. Again, he doesn't invoke the Gemara in Vav and Siyah about Moash Yisomim. So it doesn't seem like that's where he's coming from. Go see a Yerushalmi of all things. Number one. And number two, he doesn't say a word about Ribbis Drabanan. He just says love him Ribbis. Yeah. Okay. So maybe you'll tell me, okay, but it doesn't make any sense to say that he's talking about Ribbis Daraisa. What would be the heter for that? Could be. That's a good svara. But some before Rishonim not like that. There are Rishonim explicitly who quote this Yerushalmi and say it's a heter for Ribbis Daraisa. What am I talking about? So there's a whole bunch of Rishonim. But let's start with the Or Zarua. The Or Zarua and Hilchos Tzaka. Okay, we're printing. Okay. The Or Zarua is like this. This is it's really in Simon Lamed and Hilchos Tzaka. He's talking about a Gemara that he quoted in the previous Simon, which we'll get to the Gemara Blineder shortly, but let's just read Or Zarua first. Mikan diktik Mori Rabbeinu Eliezer ben Rabbeinu Yoel Levi. The Rav Yah made an inference from the Gemara that you can't lend tzedakah money with ribbis. How do I know? It says the Gemara. What does the Gemara say? The Gemara is the last Gemara in Achovah in Bava Kama. The Gemara is like this. The Mishnah on Daf Tadi, I believe it is. The Mishnah says in Bava Kama, if a person does shvoras kadi ukras tusi, then he's chayav, and then the person follows through. He does tear a shirt when the guy asked him to, so nevertheless he's chayav. So Gemara is Ramini, but we have a brisa that says not like that. Lishmor of lola abe, lishmor of lola kroa, lishmor of lola chalik laniyim. Right? That a person's only chayav, he's only responsible if he doesn't take good care of an object that's under he's supposed to be watching. If it was given to him to watch, not if it was given to him to destroy or to distribute to aniyim. Okay, so that's the context. So the Gemara says there was a story. There was a wallet, a bag of tzedakah money that came to Pumbedisa. After Rav Yosef gabe ahu gavra, and Rav Yosef, who was the guy by tzedakah, it's Gemara earlier in Bava Kama, the Lamed Zayin, Rav Yosef was the guy by tzedakah, and he gave the money as a pikadon to Hahu Gavra, that guy. Hey, that guy's always the guilty party. Pashaba, the guy was Pischei, and it was stolen, and he was Pischei, so therefore, even if he wasn't being paid, he's so Chayiv Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef said he's Chayiv, he's responsible to replace the most tzedakah. So Amalei Abayis said, wait a minute, Vatanya, we have a brisa, same brisa. So Lishmor of Lola Chalik Laniyim. You're only chayav for defaulting on shmira if the money was given to you to guard, not to distribute to aniyim. So Amar Lei, so Rav Yosef told him, no, aniyim de pumbedisa mekatz kitzlu v'lishmaru. No, the aniyim of pumbedisa each got a specified amount every week, and they knew they could rely. They're going to come to the guy by tzedakah. He's going to give them the same amount every week. You get the weekly sum of $100 for the week, and it was set in place. Rashi says kitzlu mamon kach v'kach l'shabes l'chol echad. So then that's not considered l'chalik l'aniyim. That's considered like the money belongs to those aniyim already. So Rashi says mamon sheyesh lo tovin v'karina be lishmor. That's called lishmor. That's not called l'chalik l'aniyim because the aniyim already are specified. They know how much they're getting. It's like it's theirs, and the gabbai, whoever was, is holding on to it for them. So that money is lishmor, not l'chalik l'aniyim. It already belongs to the aniyim. That's the Gemara. So the Rav Yosef says, wait a minute. Rav Yosef said the guy was chayav to pay. Alma tzedakah din hedyotla. So apparently tzedakah is considered non-holy money. Put it that way. It's not like hektish. The Eden hektish ishla, because if it were considered like hektish, amai chayv l'shlume, why would the shomer be obligated to pay? Hatznan perak hazav, if a mishnah in hazav gabi hektish, shomer chinam yonishba no sisachar eino mashalim. The halachos of shmira, the responsibilities for paying for lack of shmira don't apply to hektish. Al mashma mina it's tzedakah din hediyot leishla. From the fact that Rav Yosef paskin that the shomer was chayiv, so apparently the tzedakah money is considered like it belongs to regular people, not like it's hektish. Tzedakah does not share the status of hektish; it has the status of regular money. That's the Rav Yosef raya. Okay. So the Ozarua says, "V'aniyam mechaber." I think that's not true. I think it's mutter. You're allowed to lend tzedakah money with ribbis. How do I know? Because I have a Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi says you can borrow money ribbis for chaburas mitzvah for kiddush hachodesh, right? Doesn't that mean you can borrow money with interest? Right? So don't you see from there? Here it says, "Kimatzasi b'Yerushalmi perak ben Tzara." More he quotes the one in Sanhedrin. Da'amar Yitzchak lovin b'ribbis l'chaburas mitzvah kiddush hachodesh. So apparently, right, the Rav Yosef, the question is stuck to have a status of hedyot or status of hektish? The Rav Yosef conclusion from the Gemara in Bava Kama is that it has the din hedyot. And the Orzarua says, no, I think the Yerushalmi says that it's mutter. So apparently the Yerushalmi says it has din hektish. That's din hektish. He says, Umosh staka him gufa mitzvah hilkach mutter lavosam beribbis. Veloni hirli lokme beribbis rabbanon. And don't make a mistake that the Yerushalmi means ribbis rabbanon. No. Dimkein havle lememar lechaburas mitzvah l'kiddush hachodesh lovin bekarov l'schai v'rachok lehefsig. The Yerushalmi should have specified it only meant ribbis rabbanon, just like it does by Moshe Yisomim. Ki'aid ezu neshech. Damar Rabbi Barshela quotes the Gemara Moshe Yisomim mutter lavos and karov l'schai v'rachok lehefsig. So elahacha ribbis nakat v'stam ribbis k'tzutza doraisa. The Yerushalmi doesn't specify. So apparently, even ribbis, you're allowed to lend money, Moshe Shotzaka, and he thinks that's what the Yerushalmi means, even with ribbis doraisa. That's what the Orzarua says. No, see, as a Gemara, but the Rav Yosef better right from the Gemara. The Gemara says that a shomer is chayev to pay for Moshe Staka. The Orzarua says, didn't you read the end of the Gemara? The Gemara says that Aniyed Pumbedisa Kitzlu, make us Kitzlu. They already had them. They had a specified amount they would get every week. So therefore, he says, Mishabas Staka Laani Shavina Kriyat Staka. All right, let's imagine that I have money, Moshe Staka, and I give them to a poor person. Now he has it. So Mr. Indigent now has the money. Can Mr. Indigent lend the money beribbis? No. It's his money, right? He happens to be a poor person. And if I give him money, I'm a kind of mitzvah staka. But a poor person isn't staka. A poor person is a private person who has needs, right? He can't lend money beribbis. The halachas of ribbis apply equally to poor people, right? And therefore he says, if the Gemara, if the tzaka belongs to the ani, of course, in a kriyat tzaka, and of course you can't lend that money beribbis. And once there's a fixed amount the aniyim are getting, even though they've never gotten it in their hands yet, but that means halachically it belongs to them already. Like Rashi says, mamon sheish l'tovim, they can go to the gabbai and demand that he give it to them. So it's like the aniyim made this shomer into their shomer. And therefore, it has a din hedyot, and of course, it's also lended beribbis. But if you have money that's most tzedakah, and there's no specified amount that aniyim are supposed to get, right? Every ani who comes, I decide whether I want to give him or not, and I decide how much to give him, and it's up to the discretion of the gabbai within reason. So then that's small tzedakah, and that has halacha. He says that's like hektish, and therefore there's no ribbis. Just like there's no halachas of shmira, there's no halachas of ribbis. That's the conclusion of the Orzarua. Okay, so what the Orzarua tell me, right? The Orzarua told me the Rav Yosef held you can't lend Moshe Tzaka b'ribbis because he has a Gemara in Bava Kama, and the Orzarua says there's no right from the Gemara. The Gemara is only talking about a case where it's kitzlu, where the aniyim have a specified amount, and therefore the money already belongs to them, and therefore that's considered mammon hedyu. But if you be honest to goodness, Moshe Tzaka, mammon she'ein lo tovim. No ani can come and demand you give it to him, so I'll give it to a different ani. So that's Moshe Staka. That is a halacha like hektish, and therefore it's exempt from the halachos of ribbis, just like it's exempt from the halachos of shmira. Okay. Now, agav, everyone's assuming, but no one's telling me. Apparently, hektish doesn't have the halachos of ribbis, right? That's a gemara. That's a gemara earlier in Hazav on Dafnin Zayin. The gemara says that seemingly the gemara says that hektish is not considered achicha, and therefore there's no halachos of ribbis for hektish. Okay. So the Aruch is just saying that Moshel Tzaka have the same status as Hektish. They're not Moshel, they don't belong to Achicha, and therefore they're not subject to the halachos of Ribbis. If you want confirmation for that, there's a Chuvas Maram Rutenberg, which is written to the Or Zarua, where the Or Zarua sent to Maram Dishtikol Torah, and the Maram told him he's wrong. Okay, so we'll get to why the Maram thought he was wrong. The Maram told him he was wrong, and he says, and of course, Moshel Tzaka are called Achicha, right? So you see that was the Shiloh. The Or Zarua is claiming that it's not achicha, and therefore it's exempt from the restrictions of Ribbis. And the Or Zarua was claiming that it's not considered achicha, and therefore, the Or Zarua is claiming it's not achicha. The Maram's rejoinder is to prove that Moshel Staka are considered Moshel achicha, and therefore they are subject to Ribbis. Okay, that's the sheet of the Or Zarua. The sheet of the Or Zarua is also in the Mordechai and Bava Metzia, and in the Meiri and Bava Metzia and Daf Nazayin, although there's a different Meiri that doesn't sound like that, but at least in Bava Metzia and Daf Nazayin, the Meiri does sound like he has a shtickle Torah. Also, so a bunch of Rishonim. There's a Tashbates. It's really the Tashbates' grandson, but there's a Teshuvah and Tashbates who has this idea. The whole bunch of Rishonim who have this idea based on the Yerushalmi in Sanhedrin and Moed Katan that Moshel Tzedakah are not subject to Ribbis. So let's imagine that you are the Gemach of Riverdale. There's such a thing. There's a Gemach of Riverdale, right? Which I get emails from periodically telling me that they loan money to somebody. So if they wanted to, according to the Or Zarua, this is Moshel Tzedakah, Pshuto, and therefore if they wanted to lend their money to Ribbis, not to the Aniyim they're giving it to, but that wouldn't help. But that's not maybe a chisar and stock if you do that. But if they have extra money lying around and they'll have a heter to tie up that money. I mean, usually the Moshel stock are supposed to be available to Aniyim, but if they have a reason that they can tie it up, or they want to put it in a bank, which they can just withdraw it from whenever they want, and that bank, let's imagine, for argument's sake, is a Jewish bank, and they don't have a heter iska, and you don't believe that you can put money in a bank. Okay, there's a whole bunch of assumptions there, but let's imagine you want to be choshish for all the possibilities that you can't put money in a bank that's Jewish owned, 100% Jewish owned, no, not incorporated, nothing. According to the Or Zarua, it's still mutter because it's Moshel Staka. And Moshel Staka, you can lend and borrow Ribbis Ktutza. Okay? Spoiler alert, we don't pass like the Or Zarua. Oh well. But okay, there's such a thing. Okay? Now, as we said, the Maram has a Teshuvah, which the Or Zarua sent in the Shtickle Torah, and the Maram says it's not true. So why not? What do you do? The Or Zarua has the Yerushalmi. The Or Zarua has, he was Doicha the Raya from the Gemara in Bava Kama. So why is it wrong? So Maram says, it sounds like he's repeating the earlier argument, but he's not. Okay? Maram says, you see from the Gemara in Bava Kama, the Or Zarua is wrong. So the Or Zarua was already Doicha that Raya. So we have to read carefully. The Ravya, the way the Or Zarua quotes it, brought a Raya from the Maskon of the Gemara. Right? The Gemara says that Rav Yosef said the Shomer was Chaim. Apparently, the Moshel Tzedakah are subject to the responsibilities of Shmira, and therefore you see it, the Moshel Tzedakah are not like Hektish. That was the Rav Yozrai. To that, the Or Zarua said, cogently, that you only see that the Gemara's conclusion is only talking about where it's Kitzlahu, where there's a specified amount for each poor person. But where it's low Kitzlahu, you have no proof that the Gemara ever said that that's subject to Shmira. That's the way the Or Zarua has the discussion with the Rav Yosef. Maram says, yeah, but read the line before that in the Gemara. Right? The Gemara says Rav Yosef took this stock of money and he gave it to a certain person to go after the Rav Yosef Gabehu Gavra. The guy was Pischei, and Rav Yosef said he was Chaim. Now, what questions Abaye asked? Abaye asked, Amle Abaye Vatanya Lishmor of Lachalik Lanin. You see, you're not subject to Shmira if the money is Lachalik Lanin. Now, the Gemara could have said, what do you mean? The requirements of Shmira don't apply to Hektish. Yeah. And tzedakah money is Hektish, isn't it? According to the Or Zarua, it's like Hektish. It's not Achicha. It's not Achicha, right? Or it's not Reyehu. Same idea, right? Ki yitain ish el Reyehu kesem okelim nishmar. So all the halachas of Shmira only apply to Reyehu, and that's why Hektish is not subject to the requirements of Shmira, to the responsibilities of Shmira. So why didn't the Gemara ask the question that way? Why does the Gemara ask Lishmor of Lachalik Laniyim? Sounds like it's something specific to Moshel Tzedakah. It's not a halacha of Moshel Tzedakah. It's a halacha. There's a global question. Do the halachos does tzedakah money share the status of hektish, not being achicha or not? That question we're not proving from this Gemara. We're proving that that's a global question. That question we can prove from the halachos of Ribbis. We can prove from other places, right? So if you want to tell me it's not that hektish that Moshel Tzaka are not achicha or not reyayu, so just say that. Why does the Gemara ask from lishmor of lo lechalik la'aniyim? So the Ram says so. Adrab, you see from the fact from the Gemara that the Gemara didn't want to say it's because Moshel Tzaka are not considered achicha. Really, Moshel Tzaka are considered achicha. The Gemara has a different drasha. Lishmor of lo lechalik la'aniyim. That's why you should be potter. So that you can't get out of by saying, yeah, but the Gemara's Maskana says it's only talking about kitzlahu. Okay, but the raya was from the question, not from the answer, right? Why did the Gemara ask this question, not that question? So the fact that the Maskana, the Gemara says that the drasha we're talking about over here only applies in a case of lo kitzlahu isn't going to help me when the raya is from what the question the Gemara didn't ask. Yeah, makes sense. Clear. Okay, so that's the way the Maharam brings the raya against the Orach. So what are we going to do about that? Yeah, and he said it's not just Orach, it's a Mordechai, it's Mir. There's a whole bunch of Rishonim who say this. So I think you have to say, if you want to be actually the Orach, I think you have to say that the Orach understood that when the Gemara asks Lishma v'lo l'chalik la'aniyim, that's goof of what the Gemara was asking. When the Gemara is asking Lishma v'lo l'chalik la'aniyim, the Gemara means Lishmar and not l'chalik la'aniyim because it's not Re'ehu. Right? Now that's a very creative reading of the Gemara. Right? But otherwise, yeah. Why did the Gemara ask? That's the more simple question. It's not the hektish is the stuck is not re'eyu. It's not achicha, right? Now what? Okay, that's a. I can say whatever like I want, but why would you read the Gemara like that? Like, what's the reason? So the truth is, the alternative way of reading the Gemara is also not so pashut, right? The way the Maram, whatever the conventional wisdom reading the Gemara is also not so pashut, because what's the alternative, right? Rashi says when the Gemara asks Lishma, let's ask this way, right? What do you mean Lishma of lo l'chalik la'aniyim? I give this to you to guard and not to distribute it to aniyim. Is there a halacha in Shmira that we have to ask the mafkid what he's planning to do with this money when he gives it to me to guard? Does that matter, right? Let's say the guy tells me, I want you to guard this thing for me, but after you give it back to me, I'm going to throw it down the drain. I'm going to throw it into a bonfire. Oh, so that's Lishma of lo la'abed? No. There's no halacha that it matters what for what reason the mafkid wants this object safeguarded. That's not the point, right? That doesn't make sense. So what do you mean lishmar v'lo l'chalik la'aniyim? Who cares what the gabbai is going to do with it afterwards? Right now, to solve that problem, Rashi sounds like Rashi was trying to solve that problem, because Rashi says, I believe it's in Rashi. Hold on. Oh, Rashi says, if you give the money to somebody, amanas l'chalik la'aniyim, he says, the lo karina be lishmor. That's not called lishmor. The kevon de omer lechalkehu sulo de mafkid ninhu uman katava. As Rashi says, when the Gemara says lishmor lo l'chalik la'aniyim, the Gemara is not talking about what does the mafkid want to do with it afterwards. The Gemara is talking about for what purpose is the mafkid giving it to the nifgad? What's the nifgad supposed to do with it? Is the nifgad supposed to guard this object, or is he supposed to do something with it? So just like lishmar of lola abed means, if I give this to you and I tell you to destroy it, that's not called I gave it to you lishmar. So lishmar of lola chalik laniyim means I gave it to you to guard, and not if I gave it to you because I want you to give it out to aniyim, right? And there's Rav Yosef the guy by Saka, and he is giving it to this other person, Hahu Gavra, to be his agent to distribute it to the poor. Oh, he's not simply a nifgad. He's the I don't know. He's the Gabbai Sheni, a Gabbai Saka, right? It's his job to give out the money. Oh, so that is not lishma. It's not. He's not supposed to guard it at all. He's supposed to adrab, but he's supposed to give it away, right? So that's the chasar and shmira. If that's true, the Gemara is only talking about a case where the Gabbai Tzaka, or Yosef in this case, gave you something. Essentially, he made you a Gabbai. He made you responsible to distribute the money to aniyim. And it's not Mashtikal Torah, it's in the Shittim Kubetzis. The Shittim Kubetzis quotes from several Rishonim that that's what the Gemara is talking about. When it says Lishma v'lo l'chalik la'aniyim, it must mean where you gave it to someone to be a Gabbai Tzaka. Okay, it's not at all clear the Gemara is talking about that. Rashi says it because he's trying to explain what the Gemara, trying to explain why Lishma means lo l'chalik la'aniyim. But there's very little in the Lashon of the Gemara to indicate that. The Gemara says, Afkida Rav Yosef Gabei Ahu Gavra. Rav Yosef gave it as a pikadon to somebody. Does pikadon usually mean that he gave it to him to be the Gabbai? I don't think that's usually what the word afkada means. Afkada means I gave it to his bikadon to lishmar, right? So the Gemara asked lishmar lo l'chalek laniyim. What's the Gemara asking? So to solve that problem, most of the Rishonim said, okay, so let's make an ukimta on the Gemara. Not that he simply made him a nifgad, but he made him the gabay sheni. He made him. He deputized him to give out the money. Okay, so that's a fair reading of the Gemara, but potentially the Orzarua thought that's the Derchak, who said the Gemara is talking about a case where you made someone the Gabbai. So the Gemara must mean Lishmar v'chalek la'aniyim means the Gemara is asking, but isn't this Ma'ashal Tzedakah? So therefore, that's not considered. When the Gemara asks Lishmar, doesn't mean from the word Lishmar somehow implies v'chalek la'aniyim. The Gemara means it's not subject to Shmira because it's l'chalek la'aniyim, so it's Tzedakah money, and therefore it's not Reyehu. Now, I'll be the first one to admit to you that's a creative in quotation marks, right? That's a very creative reading of the Gemara. But I don't see any other way to miyashiv or zarua. So, and since this is a whole bunch of Rishonim, so I feel like I don't know, mashkune nafshich ba'al or zarua is at least a mitzvah to try to be miyashiv or zarua. Okay, so now that we have all of that background in the Rishonim, now let's come back to the Shibali Aleket. We have a whole bunch of Rishonim. However you make it work with the Gemara and Bava Kama, a whole bunch of Rishonim who say, based on the Yerushalmi that the Or Zarua quotes, the same Yerushalmi that the Shibali Leka quotes, that you're allowed to lend money b'ribis d'iraisa if it's Mel Shel Tzedakah because it's like hektish. Mel Shel Mitzvah is like hektish. Okay, so is it so pashut now? The Pischei Teshuvah says pashut who that the Shibali Leka only means ribis d'rabbanan. You can only borrow money for Litzorech, Seudas Shabbos, or Seudas Mitzvah if it's Ribbis Rabbanan, but not if it's Ribbis Daraisa. Why is it so pashut? A whole bunch of Rishonim who learned from the exact same Yerushalmi to mat the Ribbis Daraisa. There's zero in the words of the Shibali Leket to indicate that he's talking about Ribbis Rabbanan and not Ribbis Daraisa. So how did anyone know that the Shibali Leket is only talking about Ribbis Rabbanan? Question's clear? Yeah, long time to ask the question, right? Okay, good. So let's just make a simple cheshbon, and then we'll figure out why the Shibali like it. Why this is the Pischei Teshuvah is right. The only question is, how do we know? Okay, the answer is like this. What did we say? What's the pshat that there are Rishonim who say you're allowed to lend money for Ribbis Daraisa if it's Moshel Staka, Moshel Hektish? Why is it? What's the heter for that? Because it's not Achicha, it's not Reyehu, whatever it is, right? So it's like Hektish. That applies only to a case where the entity, for lack of a better term, that owns this money is a holy entity, right? Or it's a mitzvah entity, let's say. So if something belongs to the thing called Shevet Aniyim, right? But it's money it's mitzvah money. That's it. It's intrinsically mitzvah money, right? That you could hear, that's but you could hear someone say that's not achicha. Maybe, right? But let's say I have money. It's my money. And I have a great idea. I want to be able to have my name on the next building built by the local yeshiva. So how am I going to do that? So I don't have $1 million to give to the yeshiva. I have a great idea. I'll take money that I have. I'll lend it b'ribis daraisa, and I'll say I'm lending it so that I'm honestly I'm going to lend this money so that I can make $1 million so I can give it to the local yeshiva. Does anyone have a tzad that's mutter? So I think this pashut is awesome, right? It's my money. My goal, what I'm planning to do with this money, is to use it for a mitzvah. So, tomorrow I'll change my mind. I won't use it for a mitzvah. There's nothing about this money that makes it mitzvah money, right? The only tzad to be matir is if the money already is defined as mitzvah money, right? It's already mamon shel aniyim. It's already mamon shel hektish, whatever it is, and then I can lend it with Ribbis Daraisa, according to some Rishonim, because it's not achicha. But money that's mine, that I happen to have in mind to use for a mitzvah, of course that's money. That money belongs to achicha. Of course that money is subject to ribbis, right? So when the Shibali like it says, I'm a regular guy, right? And I'm having trouble making ends meet this week, so I'm going to borrow money ribbis for Seudas Shabbos or whatever. I have to keep up with the times. I'm making a siyum, I'm making a Seudas mitzvah, whatever it is, and I need to pay. I have to have a $15,000 Seudas mitzvah. Okay, I do it because if I don't have a $15,000 Seudas mitzvah, what will the neighbors say? And my kids will never have shidduchim, right? So of course this doesn't make any. So of course I have to make a $15,000 Seudas mitzvah with all the best, most up to date menus, right? So I want to borrow money, the ribbis. So I can't do that. The fact that I have in mind to use it for a mitzvah is very nice, but it's my money. It's my private money, right? So there's absolutely no heter to lend that money for the ribbis daraisa. The most you could hear is maybe you could be mat the ribbis darabanan. Oh, You need a makar for such a thing? Good, the Shibboleth like it has the Yerushalmi. Chazal were matir. If your goal with this is to use it for a Seudas mitzvah, for a Seudas mitzvah, okay, Chazal were matir that. It's a chiddush. We don't know exactly where it came from. It's the Yerushalmi, okay, but the Yerushalmi is sussum. Okay, so if you say that's what Yerushalmi means, fine, you have a Yerushalmi. But there's of course the Shibboleth like it couldn't mean Ribbis daraisa. No tzad. If you had a gemach for Seudas mitzvah, then maybe they could borrow money for Ribbis to help themselves stay solvent. Maybe, but it's not a gemach. This is my money, right? As a private person, I want to borrow money for Seudas Shabbos or Seudas mitzvah. There's no heter for Ribbis daraisa. Zarua doesn't think it's talking about my private money.
Also, it could also be talking about
Lo Ribbis l'chaburas mitzvah or kiddush hachodesh. That's public money.
You learned out from the stucco money.
Yeah, because the Yerushalmi. Yeah, but the Yerushalmi, the Arzarua didn't say anything about Seudas Shabbos, right? The Arzarua thinks the Yerushalmi is talking about there's a fund out there for the Chaburas Mitzvah or the Kiddush HaChodesh fund. It's out there, right? It's mitzvah money, right? Where is it? I don't know. It belongs to the public. It belongs to me. I don't know who established it, but there's money in the Welt that's set aside for this thing, right? So that I can borrow. Or the Olam wants to borrow money for this. It's not a person who wants to borrow for their personal mitzvah. It's a public mitzvah. It's a Kiddush HaChodesh, something like that. So that the Zarua says that's like Moshel Tzedakah. Yeah, has not. If you know what Chaburas Mitzvah means, let me know. But the Yerushalmi says Chaburas Mitzvah. What's a Chaburas Mitzvah? Maybe they're a Minas Chasadim Chabura. I don't know what they are. Right? They're Chaburas Mitzvah. So that's not anyone's private money. He doesn't say anything about Seudas Shabbos, and the Shibboleth like it doesn't say anything about Moshel Tzedakah. All he says is Seudas Shabbos. Right? He thinks that the Shibboleth like it has a different Yerushalmi than everybody else does. Everybody else, according to this Yerushalmi, as a heter for Ribbis Daraisa, thinks this is talking about mitzvah money that's already defined as such. The Shibboleth says, no, a new heter called I want to borrow money for a Seudas mitzvah. That's a heter for Ribbis Drabanan. No, they don't really say anything. Okay. Good. Okay, very nice. Okay, good. It happens to be, if you ever want to know, the Sefer Tanya is mostly citations from the Shibboleth Leket. If you want to know, the Chidah is made in Shem Agdolim that Kimeish Lukach Hazos. That the Sefer Tanya is taken mostly from the kids of Shibboleth Leket. Okay, very nice. I didn't see the Sefer Tanya. It's very nice. What? Yeah, I would say I don't remember seeing the Sefer Tanya saying that, but could be I just missed it. It's possible. Wouldn't be the first time. Okay, so I think it's Muchach Misvara. It has to be, right? Because there's no the other possibility the Rishonim have Timata here doesn't exist for the Shibboleth Leket. They also say that could be we'll get to that. Hold on, I'm not done yet. Hold on. I know you. I could also read the Machzik Bracha on Shulchan Aruch, which is where we're getting it from. Yeah, so that's we're getting there. Okay. Doing this whole like one-sided presentation. Of course, you have to start with one side. If you say too many sides at once, then you don't end up with anything clear, right? Yeah, of course. Don't worry, I don't have another 40 minutes. Okay, don't worry. Okay, now let's come to what Mordechai just asked. There's a totally different way of understanding the Shibboleth Leket. Have a Chaim here. They said this all started with the Magen Avram. The Magen Avram, I don't want to say the Magen Avram discovered the Shibboleth Leket, but he's the one who made it famous. The Magen Avram just quotes the Shibboleth Leket. No comment. Lov Ribbis l'tzorach Seudas Shabbos l'Seudas mitzvah. Shibboleth Leket Yerushalmi. That's all he says. So if they're no Sekalim or our time got very worked out. Right? They didn't go with this Teshuvah here. They want to argue. No, it doesn't even mean Ribbis Drabanan. Right? So, for example, the Nesiv Chaim, what's the Korban Asana? The Nesiv Chaim on the side of Shulchan Aruch, got it here. Says Lo Ribbis Perish Min Ha'akum. Can borrow money with Ribbis from a non-Jew for Seudas Shabbos. Oh, that's what. Of course, you could do that, right? So there, you're allowed to borrow money from a non-Jew Ribbis. Then he says something a little mysterious. The below mitzvah usher kedis of Yoreh Deah, because otherwise, if that wouldn't be a mitzvah, it would be usher like it says in Yoreh Deah. Now, let's back up. Where does it say in Orzarua? Where does it say in Yoreh Deah you can't borrow money for Ribbis from a guy? I learned Simon Kosam. It's not there, right? It doesn't say anywhere you can't borrow money Ribbis from a guy. It says you can't lend money Ribbis to a guy. Midrabanan, that does say in Yoreh Deah, except that Bisman Hazeh, it says mutter because of a whole bunch of a collection of reasons. Okay, but Yerushalmi wasn't working Bisman Hazeh. So in theory, you could say the Yerushalmi means that you can't, if the Yerushalmi could be working with the Din of the Gemara, that you're not allowed to lend money Ribbis to a guy. But apparently, so the Sif Chaim said, yeah, of course, and that means you also can't borrow money Ribbis from a guy, right? Why not? Because the whole problem with lending money Ribbis to a guy is seemingly the Gemara says at the end of the day is because Shema Yom Masa, maybe you'll learn from bad behavior from the guy. You're hanging out with him when you lend him money. So you could just as easily learn bad behavior if you're hanging out with him because you're borrowing money from him, right? Makes a lot of sense, except in the first Rambam not like that. The Rambam says explicitly that there's no concern with borrowing money Ribbis from a guy, even midrabana, it's totally mutter. Okay, so it's true that din doesn't appear neither le'isr nor leheter in Yoreh. Not there, right? So when the Nesiv Chaim claims that below mitzvah asr k'is of Yoreh, certainly not k'is of Yoreh. Maybe it's sustainable logically to say that based on the Gemara, but it's certainly not in Yoreh. And since I have them first Rambam not like that, and I don't want to say nobody because I don't know, I didn't see everything, but I'm not aware of anyone who says fairish that it's usher to borrow money Ribbis from a guy. Maybe there's someone who does say, but I'm not aware of anyone who says. And certainly, if there are, I don't think we pass like that. The Mishnah Melech says the Shulchan Aruch left it out because it's pashut, it's mutter. If I didn't tell you it's usher, then it's mutter, right? Ribbis with non-Jews is mutter until it says it's usher because the Torah says it's mutter, right? So if no one tells me that it's usher, then it's mutter. So the Laskana should be that's mutter. Right, so this Nesiv Chaim is a little bit shver for that reason. But before we get to, there's a reason he said that though, right? Why do you have to even get into develop mitzvah aser kedisa b'yarei? Why did the Nesiv Chaim have to go there? The answer is because the Yerushalmi can't simply mean you're allowed to borrow money b'ribbis from a guy for a Seudas Shabbos. Because I'm allowed to borrow money b'ribbis from a guy to have fun because I feel like it, right? If there's no isser to borrow money b'ribbis from a guy, so I don't need an excuse why I'm allowed to do it. Right? I don't need a heter of Seudas Shabbos, this mitzvah. I'm allowed to do it because I'm allowed to do it. There's nothing usher about it. If I want to play basketball, I'm allowed to play basketball because there's no isser. If I want to borrow money b'ribbis from a guy, I'm allowed to borrow money b'ribbis from a guy because there's no isser. That's why, right? So the Nesiv Chaim was working hard to figure out, well, why do you need a heter? So he says, oh, I'll tell you why you need a heter, because otherwise it'd be usher, kedis to be your day. You can't borrow money b'ribbis from a guy. Okay, so we demonstrated that doesn't seem to be correct, right? It doesn't seem to be correct that you can't borrow money b'ribbis from a guy. So we need another reason. Why is Yerushalmi need a chiddush? You're allowed to borrow money b'ribbis from a guy to pay for your Seudas Shabbos. You know? And if you can't come up with an answer to that question, so then the whole shop falls apart. You can't say that Yerushalmi is talking about borrowing from a guy, right? Now, full disclosure, the Mishnah Berurah passes like Nesiv Chaim or some other variation thereof. He doesn't say because otherwise it'd be usher. That doesn't say. The Mishnah Berurah just says the Yerushalmi is talking about borrowing money b'ribbis from a guy or from Yisrael b'ofen mutter, which means you're not really borrowing money b'ribbis, right? There's no, as far as I know, there's no heter to borrow money b'ribbis from a Jew. Everything that you're doing that's mutter is because it's not really ribbis, right? Okay, so you'll figure out a way that's not really ribbis, and the Yerushalmi calls that, that's a borrowed term, I guess, lovin b'ribbis. But okay, you'll figure out a way. Either it's talking about a guy or it's talking about some kind of a permissible arrangement. But if we're not going to say like in a Nesiv Chaim, so what's the chiddush? Why do you need a heter from the Yerushalmi? So I thought maybe you could say that we're a little bit barking up the wrong tree. Maybe we shouldn't say the Yerushalmi is trying to tell me a heter. The Yerushalmi is trying to tell me what I'm supposed to do. Not that you're allowed to borrow money b'ribbis from a guy for Seudas Shabbos or Seudas Mitzvah, but that you should borrow money b'ribbis from a guy for Seudas Shabbos, Seudas Mitzvah. Now, well, obviously, if I have the money to pay for it, I'm not mechuyev to, right? So if you don't, so maybe the right thing to do is you shouldn't abandon your plans for a Seudas Mitzvah or Seudas Shabbos or make a regular weekday meal. You should borrow money from a guy, even if you have to pay him ribbis. Maybe that's what Yerushalmi means. A chiddush. You would have thought you're not mechuyev to do that. Where if you're going to have to pay ribbis, you're not mechuyev to borrow money for your Seudas Shabbos, your Seudas Mitzvah, if you're going to have to pay ribbis. Kamash on Yerushalmi, you are supposed to. That's the correct thing to do, right? Now this would be based on Yisugya in beginning of second parak of Beitzah, where the Gemara says, okay, here we go. The Gemara quotes the pasuk in Nehemiah. L'chu ichlu mashmanim u'shsumam take v'shilchu maras le'nachalotam Rosh Hashanah tikadosh hayom na'adoninu v'alte'atzu ki chedesh Hashem hi ma'uschem. Right, you should go eat fancy food, drink fancy drinks, send things to people who don't have, because this day is Kadosh, and you shouldn't be sad because Chedvas Hashem hi ma'uzchem. The happiness of Hashem, the joy of Hashem will be your strength. That's about as biblical as you get. What does that mean? Right? So the Gemara also wants to know what it means. My ki Chedvas Hashem hi ma'uzchem. What does that mean? That the joy of Hashem is your strength. The Shalmi says, Amr Rabbi Yochanan, Mishum Lezer, Rabbi Shimon, Amr Lama Kadosh Baruch Hu Yisrael, Banai, Levu alai v'kidshu kedush hayom va'aminu bi v'ani pareya. Borrow on my cheshbon. You have God's expense account. Pretty good, right? He's got a lot of money. So Hashem says, don't worry. You borrow you make Shabbos the way you're supposed to make Shabbos, and I'll pay. Okay? That's the Gemara says. Now, that's one Gemara. Now, Tosfos already asks the theory of that Gemara because the Gemara says, you should make your Shabbos like a weekday. You should make your Shabbos like a weekday and not to have to take from people and not take stock up. So Tosfos answers, Hani Mili, Kishain Lo is the Girsa issue over here. So first to read the Tosfos the way we have it. Kishain Lo Lifroa. Right? When you don't see any reasonable way of paying back this loan, then don't take the loan. That's irresponsible. But if you have reason to think you'll be able to pay back this loan, so then you should borrow money. That's the Gemara in Beitz is talking about. The Goin has a different Girsa over here. The Goin says, Hani Minik She'ein Lo Nimi Lilvos. That the Gemara in Beitz is dispositive. You're always supposed to borrow money to pay for to finance your Seudas Shabbos. If you can't, so then you shouldn't take staka. Rather, you should make your Shabbos like a weekday. Okay, that's Tosfos. Now, maybe what the Yerushalmi means is that levu alai v'ani pareya. This guarantee we have from HaKadosh Baruch Hu that He'll pay us back if we borrow money for the Shabbos is not talking about a case where you have to pay ribbis. Maybe, right? Who says you're required to incur debt? Essentially, not just debt that you think. Unless Tosfos says, if you think you'll be able to pay back, reasonable you'll be able to pay back, then you're supposed to borrow money. It's not always reasonable to know whether you'll be able to pay back ribbis. Depends what kind of ribbis you have, right? Is it compounding interest? Is it a fixed rate? Is it fixed how much interest you have to pay? Not every, and it's not, paying back interest is always much harder than paying back just the principal, right? Like Rashi says in Chumash, I think, because it's a mevatz beitz va'ola. You think, you borrow money for ribbis, you don't realize like your debt is swelling. Okay, so maybe this haftacha from Hashem doesn't apply if you have to borrow money for ribbis. Hey, who said? Comes the Shibboleth Leket and says, I'll tell you why. Because the Yerushalmi says so. The Yerushalmi says, Lovin beribis l'chaburas mitzvah l'kiddush hachodesh, that for tzarech mitzvah you're allowed to borrow for a Seudas mitzvah beribis, right? And you're supposed to. Not that you're allowed to. You need a heter, otherwise it'd be usher. But because maybe it'd be usher because of being irresponsible. But you're supposed to. It's included in Hashem's haftacha levu alai v'ani pareya. And then for Huadin, he says, to the Shabbos, to the Yom Tov, right? They're also this mitzvah. That would be a different way of understanding Shibboleth Leket. That would be consistent with what let's say the Mishnah Berurah wants to say, that the Shibboleth Leket isn't coming to Mechadish Heter and Ribbis. He's just saying you're allowed to borrow money for Ribbis, but often amutter. Now, the only shayla that is, the Shibboleth Leket says it's not true only by Seudas Shabbos is Yom Tov. Adrabah, the Yerushalmi, the Shibboleth Leket is quoting, is talking about Kiddush HaChodesh. It's talking about Chaburas Mitzvah, whatever that is. The Shibboleth Leket extrapolates from there to Seudas Shabbos, Seudas Yom Tov. Is the Havtacha Levu Alai V'ani Pareya said outside of Seudas Shabbos, Seudas Yom Tov? The Gemara says about Shabbos Yom Tov. It's from Pasuk. Do I know that applies to other mitzvahs? And it's for my suggestion to be sustainable that Levu Alai V'ani Pareya applies to the Shibboleth Leket trying to apply Levu Alai V'ani Pareya even to borrowing beribis based on the Yerushalmi. You have to say that the case the Yerushalmi is talking about has Levu Alai V'ani Pareya, right? So is that true? Yeah. How am I going to find the raya for this question? So maybe we can say like this. There's another Gemara next to Amon and Beitza. The Gemara says, famous Gemara, Kol mazanosov she'adam tzuvos lo mi'roshana aroshana chutz mi'otzah Shabbos yom tovim v'otzah banav l'talmud Torah. Right? All your income is fixed for the year, besides for what you need for Shabbos, Yom Tov, and paying for your children's Torah education. Yeah, Talmud Torah. Right? So this the Gemara doesn't prove. The Gemara just says it. Right? I think it's chokli. So that your money is the amount you get is fixed for the year, but the Gemara doesn't ever really say where we get from that excludes Shabbos, Yom Tov, and Hotzelas Banav Talmud Torah. How did the Gemara know that? So Tosfos jumps in. It's Perishri. Hakol nafki mikroy dilael. Right? Everything is learned from the psukim quoted on the Amud earlier. Mizonosav the Shabbos kid the Amar levuah live ani pareya. So Tosfos makes an equation or an association between the Gemara about your income for the year being fixed from Rosh Hashanah and the Gemara levuah live ani pareya. If the Gemara says levuah, you can borrow on Hashem's account and He'll pay you back, does that mean how much are you going to borrow on Hashem's account? Lo katuv, however much you need, right? So apparently that amount is not fixed. It'll be whatever you borrow. Whatever you borrow on Hashem's account, He'll pay back. That's the God list of expense accounts, right? Whatever you pay, whatever you spend, they pay for, right? So that's how we know that Shabbos and Yontiv expenses are not included in your fixed income on Rosh Hashanah. How about I'll tell us about the Talmud Torah? Right? It's also included in Chedvas Hashem Himauschem. Chedva refers to Torah because Torah is Misamchi Lev. Okay, very nice. So Tosfos the Darshan. Okay, very good. But one thing I want to take out from Tosfos, not the Psukim, that's not my point. The point is Tosfos equated the Gemara and the Gemara Levuah Live Ani Pareh. Yeah, that's what Tosfos did. Here you have a Ritva. Ritva, unfortunately, the Ritva we have printed on a Beitza ends at the second parak, but the Shita Mekubetzes had more of the Ritva. Shishiter quotes the Ritva. Kasav Ritva. Lav davka otza Shabbos yom tovim. It's a chiddush. When the Gemara says what's not included in your annual income is Shabbos, the Shabbos Yontiv, your child's Torah education. Who adin l'chol otza shel mitzvah? Really, any mitzvah expense is included. Is not included in your annual income. But the Gemara quotes these three, Shabbos, Yantiv, and Hotzos B'Alam Talmud Torah, because those are very common expenses that people have. What are your other mitzvah expenses? How many are there? I don't know. I can't tell you what you're gonna have to spend on mitzvahs for the year. It depends what mitzvahs you do, right? If you're in the business of giving tzedakah, you have a lot of mitzvah expenses. I don't know, right? If you're not in the business of giving tzedakah, so you won't have a lot of have as many mitzvah expenses. I don't know. If you what kind of lulav do you buy? Depends if you buy a $300 Aviyam or you buy a $35 Aviyam. I don't know, right? So the Gemara says Shabbos Yom Tov. Those are examples, but really every mitzvah is included. So now, if we're going to combine this Ritva, which is a chiddush, right? The Ritva says the Gemara is lav dafka, right? The Ritva with the Tosfos, then we have is like this. The Gemara says that all hotel shel mitzvah are excluded from my annual income. If that's true, then it's included in the Levuah Live Ani Pareya, based on Tosfos cheshbon, right? So I can borrow on Hashem's account, right? For any mitzvah. Right? So now you just told me that for anything that's a mitzvah, I have Hashem's Avtacha Levuah Live Ani Poreh. If that's true, then we can sustain the explanation that I suggested before, that the Yushalmi, that the Shmuel is quoting, is saying that for any mitzvah, including Chaburas mitzvah, whatever that might be, the mysterious Chaburas mitzvah, or Kiddush HaChodesh, or Hu Hadin Shabbos Yom Tovim, you're allowed or encouraged to borrow, if you need to borrow money Ribbis from a guy. No heter nechos Ribbis. You're allowed to borrow money Ribbis, and Hashem says, "Don't worry, I'll take care of you." Right? Just if that's true, then you have a raya. Right backwards, but if you have a raya that the Mishnah Berurah and all these achronim, the Mishnah Berurah quotes, all hold like this Ritva, that any money you spend on a mitzvah is not included in your Rosh Hashanah allocation. That could have serious ramifications for how we spend money. Okay, very good. I count.